my name is Brecken Healy, and this is my informative speech on oysters and why they matter. If any of you have traveled to beaches outside of the Gulf of Mexico, you've probably noticed that the water in Galveston is much murkier than it may be on the east or west coast. This is for two main reasons. One being that the Mississippi River carries large amounts of sediment from across all of America into the Gulf of Mexico. The second reason is that oysters have significantly declined in the Gulf of Mexico. Oysters are extremely important to the health and cleanliness of the marine ecosystem. However, oyster populations have been on the decline for years. Because of this, it has taken a toll on the ecosystem. Because of this, we must all make a collective effort to restore oyster populations to improve the environment. In addition to the research I have done for this speech, I have also taken several marine biology related classes in my past 2 years attending this campus. In these classes, we have discussed the importance of oysters and their declining population. Because of this, I can assure you that I'm a credible source of information on this topic. Because oysters have a significant impact on the Gulf of Mexico, and considering that this campus is located in Galveston, oysters are certainly relevant to you. First, I will start off by explaining the importance of oysters, then I will explain the oyster crisis, and finally, I will explain the details of oyster conservation. Allow me to start off by explaining why oysters are important. Oysters are important for the well-being of the marine ecosystem, mainly because they clean seawater. Oysters take part in water filtration and nutrient recycling. A North America Global Seafood article about oyster restoration projects states, a single oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. This removes sediments, pollution, and algae from the water. Oysters are also essential to the food web. This North America Global Seafoods article about oyster restoration projects also states that oyster reefs act as habitats and breeding grounds for crabs, fish, and other marine species. This article further explains that oyster reefs act as natural barriers, reducing wave energy and preventing shoreline erosion. This makes them essential for coastal protection. Otters, which are keystone species in the food web, rely on oysters as a source of food. Although oysters are extremely important, there is one major issue. Oyster populations have been on the decline. Overharvesting of oysters has greatly reduced the oyster population. Oysters have lost habitats due to human development, and diseases cause mass extinction events for oysters. Pollution has also taken a negative impact on oyster populations. Ocean acidification has weakened oyster shells, and runoff from agriculture has polluted the water quality. Now that you understand the issue, allow me to explain what people are trying to do to solve it. An Audubon article about oyster conservation states over 80% of oyster reefs have been lost. This article further explains that this leaves coastal habitats vulnerable to erosion and climate change. The Hart Research Institute at Texas A&M Corpus Christi explains that although Texas is the second largest oyster harvester in the country, with harvesting over millions of pounds of oysters in its bays each year, there is no mechanism in place to return oysters to the bay and maintain or restore oyster reefs and degraded habitats. Conservationists have been trying to restore oyster reefs because oyster reefs are more effective than artificial concrete reefs. An Audubon article about oyster conservation explains, in Tampa Bay, recent severe weather put living shorelines to the test. Back-to-back hurricanes hit the area in late 2024, while Leachy was overseeing the construction of new oyster reefs backwaters, overseeing around 4 Audubon-managed sanctuaries. Once the storm passed, the results were clear. Along stretches of the coast without structures, wind and waves washed sand away, but on shores where new reef balls were already constructed, mangroves still stood tall. Oyster reefs effectively protected Tampa Bay from hurricanes in 2024, whereas parts of the bay without oyster reefs were destroyed. Organizations such as NOAA have funded the reconstruction and conservation of oyster reefs. An Audubon article about oyster conservation states, to rebuild reefs, engineers use various bases where baby oysters, called spat, can grow. This article further states that conservationists offer hollow concrete reef balls and mesh bags full of oyster shells, recycled oyster shells. A North America Global Seafoods article about oyster restoration projects explains that oyster shells are a crucial resource for oyster restoration, and that many projects collect oyster shells from restaurants and fish markets to use as foundation for oyster reefs. I'm sure this has been a lot of information for you to take in, so allow me to summarize it for you. Oysters are essential to the health of both marine and coastal environment ecosystems. However, oyster populations and reefs have greatly declined. This has left many ecosystems vulnerable to storms and unclean water. Because of this, several organizations have made a great effort to restore oyster reefs. I hope you all have learned something of value from my speech today, and I urge all of you to make some sort of contribution to oyster restoration projects, whether that be through spreading awareness or monetary donations. And we can all make a difference, and as more people continue to try, hopefully oysters can make a comeback. These are my sources, and thank you for listening.